Hello and welcome back. This is the week 4 lecture. So today we're going to talk about The Thin Blue Line, directed by Errol Morris. This came out in 1988, and it is the first documentary that we'll be watching this semester. We are going to watch a couple of other documentaries later on. Roger and Me by Michael Moore. Some of you might have heard of that. Michael Moore has kind of become a somewhat famous figure, sort of well-known. Well, maybe not so much now, but in the early 2000s, back to the 90s, he became somewhat of a pop culture figure. So we're going to be talking about him later, and he figures pretty prominently in Pearson's book, as you may have noticed. And then we're also going to be watching Hoop Dreams towards the end of the semester. That's our final documentary. So we are going to delve a little bit into the world of quote-unquote nonfiction filmmaking. Documentaries to me are interesting to talk about. They're different from fiction films in a lot of ways. One of the things we can talk about today in reference to Morris and The Thin Blue Line is, some of the ways in which he clearly borrows techniques and methods and sort of stylistic cues from fiction films. And Pearson talks a little bit about that in the book and how that sort of affected the reception of this film. It was pretty popular, critically acclaimed, but not necessarily viewed universally upon its release as a true documentary. A lot of people thought Morris was sort of importing a lot of aspects of fiction to the film, but nevertheless, as Pearson talks about in the chapter that we're reading this week, this film has some real world impact. It arguably contributes to getting Randall Dale Adams off of death row, exonerated, so it does some real good, it does some real work in the world, but it was also kind of viewed as not maybe a straight up documentary when it first came out. But I would argue that a lot of the techniques and the methods that we see here that Morris is utilizing, they would become, and probably are now, pretty standard in a lot of the documentaries, a lot of the docudramas that we watch. So we can talk a little bit about true crime, that genre, which is very popular right now. I'm not going to credit Morris for inventing that genre. I don't think he did. And I think even Pearson points out, and other critics point out, that Morris was certainly innovative, but he wasn't the first to do a lot of the things that we're seeing in this film, but he certainly helped to popularize a lot of the methods that we're going to be talking about, some of the techniques that we see. And again, we see a lot of those techniques today in a lot of documentaries. So it's an important film. Morris is an important figure, kind of an eccentric guy, which is a little bit of a theme here through the first few weeks of the semester. Has a little bit in common with Jarmusch. As has been the case before, Pearson has a little bit of personal insight here that he offers. So we're reading the chapter in the book, kind of getting back to the book this week. The chapter starts on page 103. It's called Inspector Errol Morris Walks the Thin Blue Line. So once again, Pearson's a little bit involved in some aspects of this movie. He knew Morris personally. He sort of followed Morris's career. So like he's able to do with Parting Glances, and I think to a lesser extent with Jarmusch, he's able to kind of provide some, like I said, personal insight, some experience. He's kind of around when all of these things are happening. So I think Pearson mentions in the chapter that Morris originally conceived this movie, this documentary, as being about Dr. James Grigson, the so-called Dr. Death. And he gets mentioned in the movie, but sort of late in the film, around maybe the 1 hour mark, I think is what I marked down as the first time that we really hear about this guy. He plays a pretty important role in the story of Adams, who kind of becomes our protagonist. Randall Adams, this sort of drifter, sort of a weird guy, an eccentric guy in his own way. But Grigson was originally going to be the focus of Morris's work. And in the words of Pearson, I think Pearson puts this very well. So Grigson's a Dallas psychiatrist who, quote, according to Pearson, consistently appeared as a very friendly witness for the prosecution in death penalty cases to confirm the likelihood of the defendant killing again if given the chance. So this is what Grigson does in regard to Adams. He interviews Adams. According to Adams, it's a very brief interview, and then Grigson testifies that Adams is a dangerous sociopath who will kill again if set free, So that apparently has some role in the initial conviction that this film helps to overturn or throw out. I can't remember all the legal ins and outs, but eventually Adams is exonerated and released after serving, I think, 12 years on death row in prison. So we'll talk a lot, at least a little bit today, about the death penalty and how it sort of looms as this almost like a character or just a really important trope that runs through this entire film, and it seems to have a lot to do with some of the legal machinations that we see over the course of the film. So we'll talk about that. But again, Morris was originally supposed to make a film about Grigson, but he ends up, I think, interviewing or meeting Adams in some way, through the course of his research as he's working on this film about Dr. Death. And he sort of learns about Adams's case, as we know, convicted of killing a police officer in Dallas. He professes his innocence, claims that it was this other guy, David Harris, this young guy who he was with that day of the murder. So we learn all about this over the course of the film, and apparently Morris became so interested in Adams and the case, he decided to sort of, refocus and really make the film about Adams, and Grigson just sort of plays a supporting role. I don't think he even really appears in the film. He's not interviewed. He's not one of our interview subjects. I'm not even sure if we get any footage of him. We hear about what he says, and we hear Adams talk about him. But he kind of recedes into the background, and this film really becomes about Adams, to a lesser extent Harris, but really it's just about this case. And that's why it reminds me of a lot of contemporary true crime dramas, these shows that have proliferated over the last, half decade or so. And like a lot of these contemporary films or series, we had this sort of deep dive into a very particular case that's very murky and sort of ambiguous. We have these sketchy, eccentric characters. We learn about them. We learn about the investigation. And, this movie, when it came out, it really sort of disturbed a lot of people. It raised some pretty disturbing questions about our criminal justice system, but also just about sort of the process of knowing things, like how knowledge works. And Morris starts to, a distinctive style of his own begins to emerge through this film. So Morris has become, in the years since, a pretty well-known, pretty famous documentary filmmaker, and he's known for having kind of a particular style. He's known for his interviewing technique, which is also kind of distinctive. So we'll talk about some of his particular methods and aspects of his style as we move along. But let me just give you a little bit of bio on Morris. Pearson, for the most part, talks about this in the chapter, but Morris had already come out with a film called Gates of Heaven back in 1978, and it had been pretty well received. Pearson is a fan. So again, Pearson's kind of following Morris's career. Morris reminds me of Jarmusch a little bit in that he doesn't initially set out to become a filmmaker. Jarmusch eventually goes to film school, but he originally goes off to college to study literature. Morris is another kind of jack of many trades. He's a musician, a talented cello player as a youth. He kind of abandons music later. He goes to college, I think at the University of Wisconsin, where he majors in history. Then he kind of bounces around. He's a little bit of a drifter for a while, perhaps not totally dissimilar to Adams. I think probably a little less sketchy, perhaps, but he works a series of odd jobs. And then he sort of resurfaces as a grad student briefly at Princeton. He kind of talks his way into, I think, one of their graduate programs. Then he ends up at UC Berkeley, where I believe he gets a master's degree in philosophy. So he's very interested in philosophy and history. Those interests show up in his movies. A lot of critics talk about his interest in epistemology, which is the branch of philosophy that concerns itself with sort of the nature of knowledge. We don't have to get too deeply into that. I'm no philosopher myself, but we can certainly talk about the nature of knowledge in regard to this film, because I think that's something he's exploring, he's investigating. How do we know things? How do we know that we know things? Why do we choose to believe certain things? He seems very interested in a lot of those questions. So he doesn't really get into filmmaking until sort of the late 70s, after he's done with his schooling. I think he's sort of out in the sort of San Francisco film scene. He kind of gets involved out there. Pearson talks a little bit about that indie scene in San Francisco, which is kind of vibrant and producing filmmakers and films during the same period that the sort of New York City scene that Pearson's enmeshed in is also vibrant and producing a lot of indie films, a lot of up-and-coming filmmakers. But Pearson talks about traveling west. He goes to film festivals out there. He's in business with some people, distributors, other people in the film business out on the West Coast in the Bay Area. So I think that's where Morris kind of gets his start. He comes out with Gates of Heaven in the late 70s, and then he does a series of other films. Some are pretty well known, at least to people who like watching documentaries. Sometimes we think about that as sort of a specific type of person. I don't think that's always fair, but maybe not totally off. So yeah, Gates of Heaven in 78. Vernon, Florida came out in 1981, about this town in Florida where people are running a particularly gruesome sort of like insurance scam. I don't want to give it away. If you guys want to watch that, that's a good one. And then he waited, I think, 7 years after Vernon, Florida. Yeah, according to the math, about 7 years before he comes out with The Thin Blue Line in 88. And then in 91, A Brief History of Time, which is about Stephen Hawking, the famous physicist. Later in 97, Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control. And then in 2003, he comes out with The Fog of War, which is about the former Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who kind of was part of the reason we got so bogged down in Vietnam back in the late 60s. I remember watching that movie in college. That was probably my first exposure to Morris, and I've since gone back and watched some of his other stuff. And then in 2010, Tabloid, and then 2018, American Dharma, which was about the 2016 election and the rise of Trump. So like I said, Morris has kind of got a particular style, like most of these filmmakers that we're watching over the course of this semester. He sort of incorporates, again, things that we might consider fictive elements. We see some of it in The Thin Blue Line, dramatic reenactments, some footage from other movies. The music, people pay attention to the musical scores. He often uses Philip Glass, I think, as his composer, his guy in charge of the music. I think Glass does the music for this particular film. But also I mentioned Morris's style of interviewing. You guys might have noticed here, we jump straight into interviews. We hear from Adams. We hear from Harris. We hear from some of the detectives who were working the case. We hear from a whole lot of people. We meet quite a wide cast, quite an array of different people. And we don't have a narrator. We don't have some kind of moderator, some kind of authoritative guide who can walk us through this and sort of help us to separate fact from fiction, truth from lies. And that's kind of the point, right? This is a murky story involving, frankly, some kind of marginal people, criminals, drifters, people who might not strike us as totally reliable, right? So that's kind of a central tenet, I think, of this particular film, and people certainly noticed it at the time. Again, in the late 80s, it was a little bit novel. A lot of the things that Morris is doing now, a lot of it might seem more typical. But just thinking about the way he conducts these interviews, you guys should have noticed that Morris himself, the interviewer, does not appear. He remains hidden. He remains very much in the background. And for the most part, we don't even hear the interviewer. Now, I think near the end, when we get that pseudo confession from Harris, I do think we hear some of the questions. But for the most part, we don't hear the interviewer. We don't see the interviewer. There's not a whole lot of mediation or sort of interference from any outside force, from any outside presence. We mostly just hear from the principal players, and they're allowed to kind of present their stories. Sometimes their stories are contradictory. Sometimes we might believe their stories. In other cases, we don't. But like I said, we don't have sort of the equivalent, if we're thinking about this maybe in more literary terms, we don't have that omniscient third-person narrator who can tell us what's going on, who can tell us what really happened. We don't get that. Instead, we're forced to rely, like I said, on this cast of sort of unreliable narrators who are telling all of these different strands, these different threads of this larger narrative that I think ultimately is very much about law enforcement. It's about epistemology, like I was saying. It's about the nature of knowledge. How do we know things, and how can we come to believe in the things that we supposedly know? There's questions like that, sort of these big philosophical questions, but then I think there's also some pretty practical questions about maybe our criminal justice system, the way we deal with certain types of crimes, certain types of suspects. I think we can certainly consider certain investigative methods that were used here, the way the case was pursued, the way Adams was treated versus Harris, I think, leads to some interesting questions. The nature of the death penalty, I think, is on the table here because it gets mentioned a lot, not just through Dr. Death and the fact that clearly Adams, like we said, is on death row. Harris, too, ends up on death row. He's the guy that we ultimately think killed the police officer, Officer Wood, in Dallas back in the late 70s. But he's later picked up for killing somebody else in a sort of home invasion. He's trying to abduct the guy's girlfriend. The guy runs at him. Harris shoots, kills him, is later arrested and convicted for that crime, and later executed by the state of Texas for that crime. But we get that confession, or what nearly amounts to a confession, from Harris on tape near the end of the film. At the very least, he seems to say essentially that Adams didn't do it, which would lead us to believe that Harris probably did, based on some other things that we know about him. I think as viewers, we have a lot to sift through. But again, this reminds me of a lot of true crime dramas from today. We get the dramatic reenactments. We get a lot of interviews from that, that diverse cast of characters. But like I said, think about the absence of that sort of omniscient style narrator, that guide, that sort of authoritative voice that can help walk us through the events. That would have been pretty typical in traditional older documentaries. So people noticed that Morris was removing that element and sort of throwing us right into the middle of this case. And that was a little bit bewildering, a little bit frightening at times, but it also kind of brings us closer and perhaps makes everything seem more immediate. So again, there's a lot of attention on his reenactments. So we get interviews, and we get pictures and some like real life footage, but then that's interspersed with these very dramatic, sort of stylized reenactments of various things that happen, namely the murder itself. I think Pearson, or maybe I'm getting him confused with somebody else, somebody refers to the style or the sort of visual tone of the reenactments as sort of being like B-movie style reenactments, like kind of maybe a little over the top. Again, very stylized. We have a lot of close-ups. Pearson mentions that, almost sort of fetishizing certain objects. or certain moments in the shooting. So there's that. We get some footage from the drive-in movies, that Harris and Adams are watching on the night of the murder. So we do get these other elements sort of inserted into our larger fictive universe. It's not just interviews. It's not just the factual material that's presented. But again, I think, at least for me, I think for a lot of modern viewers, that style of mixing interviews with sort of, fiction movie quality reenactments, or again, we might think of them as B movies, sort of cheesy, over the top, but again, they're staged, they're stylized in a way that's at least reminiscent of, crime films, fiction films that feature violence and murder. They might be almost satirizing those types of movies in some way, or at least sort of utilizing familiar tropes, sort of zeroing in on certain aspects of the violence, certain aspects of the action. So people notice that, and I think I don't think Pearson talks about this, but I've read it somewhere else. The reenactments actually had their own production designer, this guy named Ted Bafalukas. And that, I think, encourages us, or demands of us, really, that we pay more attention to mise-en-scene. Right? And that's just, again, all the visual elements that aren't directly involved with cinematography or, just the cameras. So set design, costumes, use of props, and even how the actors in those reenactments are moving, right? The certain poses that we see, again, sort of stylized filming techniques, certain repetition, but those segments of the film were almost sort of conceived and done during the production stage almost kind of separately, because again, they might have a little bit more to do in some ways with fiction film. So you have your own production designer, maybe your own art team, a separate art team working just on the reenactments, and then of course the interviews and some of like the archival footage that brings us back to the here and now, to the reality. But over time, and this is where a lot of critics noticed, the lines between the sort of over-the-top reenactments, the kind of fiction film aspects, and the real-life stuff, those lines become blurry. Because as we continue to follow this case, it becomes rather surreal, maybe a little cinematic in some ways, perhaps reminiscent of other movies. Again, we get this sense that Harris at least kind of styles himself or thinks of himself as kind of this bandit, this sort of romantic old-time criminal. So the real-life events and just the strange nature of the case, the way Adams seems to get railroaded, the conflicting accounts, it all sort of adds up and becomes a little surreal, a little strange, a little bizarre, uncanny, perhaps. So again, the lines between fiction and nonfiction might get a little bit blurry. So again, Morris isn't the first to take out the narrator, to jump straight into interviews, and to use these kinds of dramatic, stylized reenactments, but he helps to popularize those methods for sort of a future wave or generation of documentary filmmakers. So again, we're stuck with all of these different characters. Some might strike us as somewhat reliable, others not so much, but we see right away we have to spend a lot of time with Adams and Harris, our two prime suspects, and neither one might seem particularly credible. Adams is described as Pearson as being none too bright, which is one potential characterization. I don't know if I totally agree with that. I think Pearson calls him not bright, but he does have like flashes of insight. But I think the only real example Pearson gives of one of these flashes of insight is the way Adams describes Dr. Death as looking like an ostrich, which I guess is accurate. It seems like Pearson's giving him credit for that, but not much else. I don't know. To me, Adams doesn't come across as especially dense. He seems strange, Again, he's kind of a drifter. He's come to Texas. He's been traveling. He's originally from Ohio. And he tells a little bit of his life story over the course of the movie, but he served in the Army. He was a paratrooper. I don't know if he actually saw combat, but he was serving during Vietnam. I don't know if he actually went to Vietnam, but then he and his brother, I think, travel to California, and then later they come to Texas. He claims that he finds work shortly after arriving in Dallas. But there's something about Adams. Like, overall, I believe that he's not the killer. I mean, I think that case is made pretty well largely by Morris and the way he tells this story. And like I said, the film played at least some role in Adams eventually getting released from prison. But Adams still strikes me as a pretty unreliable narrator, somebody who doesn't give us necessarily the most coherent, consistent set of events. He does obviously acknowledge that he's picked up by Harris. He runs out of gas. Harris picks him up, gives him a ride. Harris is a 16-year-old who's stolen a neighbor's car and left his hometown of Vidor, Texas, which is in East Texas, right outside of Beaumont. If you guys are in any way interested or familiar with Texas geography, that's in the far eastern part of the state, kind of swamps, bayous, not maybe the stereotypical image of Texas that we often get. Texas is so big, it kind of has all these distinct kind of geographical regions. We often think about West Texas, the high plains, cowboys. East Texas is a little different. East Texas is a little bit more like Louisiana or Arkansas, which it borders. So Harris is sort of this juvenile delinquent, with a penchant for violence and a real prolific criminal career already underway at 16. He's stolen a car. He's in Dallas just sort of joyriding, and he picks up Adams, who's run out of gas, and they just kind of hang out for the rest of the day. Adams is much older, late 20s, so it kind of begs the question, and I think Adams even asked this question at some point, why did I get sucked into this? Why did I hang out with this kid all day and allow him to sort of get me into all of this trouble? They drink some beer, they smoke some pot, they go to the drive-in, watch some movies, and then, according to Adams, they eventually, they just sort of get some burgers or whatever. But what's weird, Adams claims he eventually gets back to his motel, but he blacks out, according to his own account. It gets mentioned in the movie. I don't know if it's really emphasized, but again, this is part of what makes Adams so strange. It seems likely that Harris is the shooter, but we're not entirely sure about the chronology or at least I'm not, the sequence of events, because we know that Harris claims, of course, that he was the passenger in the car and that Adams was, I think, at that point driving, and it was Adams that killed the cop as he approached the window during this sort of routine traffic stop. I guess the guys were drunk. They didn't have their headlights on, so the cops pulled them. But according to Adams, he claims he doesn't really remember the part of the night that included the cop. At least that's my recollection. He claims to have blacked out, and the detectives, at least one of the detectives interviewed in the film, mentions this. And he's pretty convenient lapse of memory, and apparently his memory kicks back in when he gets back to the motel. Harris takes him back to the motel where Adams is staying with his brother, and then Adams claims from that point on he has a very quiet, sedate evening. He goes upstairs, he watches the end of the Carol Burnett Show, which is a popular sitcom in the late 70s, a show that my parents used to watch. He makes himself a sandwich, goes to bed, and his brother's been asleep in the room, apparently, this whole time. So maybe it's because they were drinking, maybe Adams just kind of took a nap. It's not really clear what's going on during that unaccounted for time. But if you notice during the interviews, he even acknowledges that he signed some kind of confession or a statement, not admitting to shooting the police officer, but admitting to being with Harris for, several hours, getting dropped off eventually at the end of the night. But I think in that statement, he says or implies that he has this period where he doesn't remember what was going on, and it seems like the shooting probably occurred during that time. So we don't know. I don't know if Adams was in the car when Harris did it, or if Harris had already dropped him off at that point. And I think there's still some clearly the police officer, the detectives, investigating the case, they don't believe Adams. But then we have to wonder why. Is it because Adams is just inherently untrustworthy? Is it because his story doesn't quite add up? Or are there other reasons? And that's one of the most interesting things to me about this film. Why are the cops so eager to believe Harris? When Harris basically tells them, hey, I know who killed, the cop. I was there. I saw it. And they pretty much accept Harris's story, the detectives, and we hear from several of them. These Dallas detectives who were on the case, there's like 3 of them that I can remember that are sort of distinct. And then we hear from another cop, I think in Vidor, which again is Harris's hometown. And this cop has a lot of experiences with Harris because he's constantly getting arrested and brought in. But yeah, what is the nature of knowledge? What do we know? What did the cops know? And how do the cops know it? They largely accept Harris's story. So then the question is, well, why? Why is Harris more believable? Why is he more trustworthy than Adams? Couple of different, I think, possibilities or theories sort of floating around out there. We could think about the fact that Harris is young, right? He's a teenager, and the cops themselves describe him as a rather affable, good-natured young fellow. I think one of the detectives specifically says he seemed like a really nice kid. And then the Vidor cop, while acknowledging Harris's extensive criminal catalog, does point out, almost like as an amused kind of just sidebar, just like an observation, he's like, in my personal dealings with the guy, he was always very polite and very nice to me. It was always yes sir, no sir. He never gave off any vibe of hostility. And again, he's almost saying it in a sort of incredulous way. Like, I've dealt with a lot of criminals. Clearly, a lot of criminals don't like police officers, don't typically get along with police officers. But Harris is very cordial and very friendly and polite in his dealings with a lot of these cops. And that seems to go a long way. Again, we don't have a narrator. We don't have Morris stepping in to sort of tell us, hey, pay attention to this. But it does seem rather relevant, perhaps, because the cops just seem to kind of like Harris. And again, I think we need to interrogate why. What are what are the specific reasons? His age, his youth might have something to do with it. We hear at one point somebody say, oh, here in Vidor, we don't want to, ruin young people's lives. So maybe this idea that I think we hold pretty dear in our culture to kind of give people second chances. Clearly, Harris was a troubled youth, but people wanting to still believe in him, give him a second chance. Maybe it was just his politeness. But we also hear another theory from Edith Morris, who's one of the lawyers on the case, and she's very insightful. She's one of the people I think that we can believe. She seems like a very credible source, and I just dropped my pen. But she mentions the idea of the death penalty, once again, factoring into the decision making here, because she says Harris would have been too young to be eligible to be executed by the state of Texas, whereas Adams, in his late 20s, I think, was certainly old enough. So she claims, and again, maybe we believe this, maybe we don't, but her theory, at least part of it, seems to be that the cops pursued Adams because they wanted to put the killer of this police officer to death. And again, we hear the cops themselves talk about the nature of sort of solving cop murders. And, one of the detectives says, we normally closed these kinds of cases really fast, which, again, sort of makes you think, does that mean that you guys are just really good and you're finding the culprit really fast? Or does it mean that you're finding the first person that could potentially have done it and you're just sort of railroading them like they railroaded Adams? They certainly seem to jump on Adams without much of a second thought. But the detective says, this was taking longer. We didn't have anything. We didn't have as many leads as we would normally have in a case like this. So, a month passes and we were still sort of nowhere. So maybe there was a creeping sense of desperation. Maybe there was this idea that we got to nail Adams for it because we don't know anything else. We don't have any other suspects other than Harris, obviously. But Harris gives them this ready-made narrative, this prepackaged narrative. Yeah, I was hanging out with this guy. He's kind of a weird guy, drifter, don't really know much about him. We were drinking, and then he pulled out a gun and he did this. So it sounds pretty good to the cops. And they're able to pick Adams up. According to him, they sort of try to force a confession out of him. They try to use threats, intimidation. So according to Edith, I'm sorry, I say Edith Morris. I think it's Edith James. I'm getting her. I don't think she's married to Errol. I think it's Edith James is the name of the lawyer. And again, she thinks it has to do with the death penalty. And we can maybe surmise that in cases like this, where you have the killer of a cop in question, the Texas authorities, the DAs, the police departments in Texas really vigorously pursue the death penalty. And there are some statistics that we can look up that kind of support that. Texas, for a while there, put a lot of people to death. And I think they still do. I think they're generally among the nation's leaders in executions. Not all states administer executions, but Texas does. And they kind of, again, are a little more gung-ho, perhaps, than others. So, some of us might be pro-death penalty, some might be anti, but the idea that Adams is a more attractive fall guy just because they can put him to death, it's at least interesting. We might not accept what Edith James is saying there, but it's certainly possible. Again, does it have more to do with Harris giving a young white kid a sort of free pass, giving him second chances, or is it more elemental? Is it more fundamental? Does it just come down to the fact that the cops need answers? This case is dragging on, right? A cop is dead. They need answers. They need not only a suspect, but somebody they can convict, somebody they can execute for this heinous crime. And Adams fits the bill, right? He doesn't really have anybody that can vouch for him. And again, a strange detail that one of the detectives points out is that, we might think that Adams's brother could have vouched for him to some extent, at least confirm what time he came home, but maybe he didn't wake up. I mean, it's unclear. Adams himself says that his brother was asleep the whole time, even while he's watching TV, making a sandwich, opening and coming into the room. I don't know. Again, I don't know if I believe all of that, but the cops certainly seem skeptical because at some point Adams's brother sort of retracts whatever initial version of events he offers and kind of refuses, according to the cops, to cooperate or testify in his brother's defense, or sort of, he doesn't really, almost like he declines the opportunity to help provide his brother with an alibi. But again, maybe he can't because he's asleep this whole time and his brother's out hanging out with Harris. So he doesn't really know what his brother's doing. He doesn't really know where his brother is until he gets back to the motel. And maybe he remains asleep even then. So there's nobody really there for Adams. There's nobody to vouch for him. There's no eyewitnesses that can say, yeah, I saw him, come in, do this. So he's maybe convenient. And, he fits the bill and he gives them an answer. He gives them the answer that they're looking for. So there's some different possibilities. I'm not sure, but based on what we hear and see, the evidence presented in the film certainly doesn't really seem like Adams did it. By the end of the film, Harris certainly seems like the culprit. And then we get that sort of pseudo confession where Harris seems to be admitting to it. So when this movie came out, a lot of critics sort of viewed it as almost a work of investigative journalism. And, and as Pearson points out, Morris had worked as a private eye, sort of like a private detective, one of the many odd jobs that he had held before his filmmaking career really took off. So Morris was very interested in criminal investigations among his many other interests. But a lot of the other critics at the time picked up on this sort of surreal, Kafka-esque quality. I think Pearson uses that phrase. Just the way Adams gets railroaded and the way the facts can sort of get twisted to fit a convenient narrative that Harris and these Dallas detectives sort of craft. And I'm assuming the DA, whoever was prosecuting the case, they sort of craft this argument. And again, we're not sure if the truth is playing the number one role here, or if there are some other motives. We hear, I think it is the DA, it's the prosecuting lawyer who I think is quoted as saying the best lawyers, can get, anybody can get a guilty man convicted, right? But it takes a real talented lawyer to get an innocent man convicted. So almost suggesting that, it was acknowledged by many that Adams was innocent, but they were going to pin it on him anyway. I think it's the judge at one point who's quoted as saying, who cares what happens to this guy? He's just a drifter. Again, no real family ties, no real connections in Dallas, nobody to vouch for him or stick up for him. So maybe he's just a convenient fall guy. Or maybe they just want to believe in the redeemable qualities of young David Harris, this polite teenager who later joins the Army, commits crimes in the Army, goes to California, commits crimes there. He's just an incorrigible criminal, probably a sociopath. But remember, Grigson, Dr. Death, interviews Adams and declares that Adams is a sociopath who's likely to kill again. But we all know that that's really true of Harris. Because even though he essentially gets away with killing Officer Wood in Dallas, like we've said, he later kills somebody else and ends up executed for that crime. So it's just a compelling story, if nothing else. The narrative that Morris is telling here, it's kind of frightening, right? Some critics, again, they pointed out how it seems almost hard to believe at times that these things are happening to Adams. I have a couple of quotes here from critics. One called it more of a waking nightmare than it is a docudrama. Again, that's an interesting way to read it. More of a waking nightmare than a docudrama. Another calls it a moody horror story, which, again, I think it kind of is. And if we think about the music, if we think about the reenactments, again, I would encourage you guys to really look at the reenactments and think about the set design and just the overall sort of production qualities of those reenactments. Think about mise-en-scene. Think about just everything, like how it looks, the actors, the way the scenes are sort of staged, what we're seeing there. But then you can also think about camera work. That's a whole separate element. You can think about the close-ups. You can think about maybe a use of repetition, what Pearson refers to as kind of fetishizing certain objects or certain aspects of the murder. So there's a lot of technical things that I think contribute to this sort of nightmarish, surrealistic, Kafka-esque feel. But then there's also just the fact that Adams is going through a nightmare. And if we believe that he's innocent, then that's obviously very scary. Another critic calls it the tale of justice gone wrong. Again, that's how a lot of people read it. Like, what makes this so scary is, we see how maybe fragile some of our standards and kind of, values connected to criminal justice might be. We might see, some would call it the unreliability. Others might just say, again, it's the blurry line between fact and fiction. Sometimes people want to believe something enough to where they do believe it. And sometimes we have motives for believing things that might not be directly tied to seeking the truth, which again is suggested here by some of the interview subjects, that maybe there were other motives. Maybe the Dallas police had other reasons for pinning this on Adams beyond just, we think it's Adams. But again, I think there's sort of this this larger question. It's not just the criminal justice system, right? Because I think what I'm impressed with overall is that within the system, we're relying on police officers, lawyers, judges, just people, right? Regular people. So I think the larger question is more about just our systems of understanding. How do we know things? And how reliable is most of our knowledge? All of this can go pretty wrong, pretty horribly wrong, pretty easily. So the thin blue line, that concept, that phrase or term, a lot of us think of it as referring to the police, and we hear the reference here. I think the judge talks about it, how this concept of, the thin line separating society from chaos, and that line is kind of represented by law enforcement, sort of protecting the public, keeping us safe from the chaos and the danger that's lurking on the other side. But, I think the key word here might be thin. It's a thin line. And these forces that we're relying on, law enforcement, the court systems, they're not infallible. So sometimes that line gets crossed, that line gets blurry, and somebody like Adams, who, though he does seem a bit sketchy and perhaps not the most reliable of narrators, he doesn't have a criminal record, he doesn't have a violent past, unlike Harris, who again is sort of a prolific criminal. There's not a lot of reasons to suspect Adams of doing something this murderous. We can certainly suspect him of bad judgment and perhaps bad choice in friends, but all signs point to Harris as the sociopath, Harris as the dangerous murderer, yet he kind of slips through the cracks, at least for a while, and Adams loses many years of his life on death row. So, again, I think overall Morris strikes a pretty good balance between the sort of fundamental, purposes or functions of documentaries, which are to convey information, to illuminate things, to enlighten us, educate us in certain ways, to kind of, in this case, walk us through this very complex murder case. We meet a lot of interesting people, and again, we get so many versions of events. We haven't even talked about the eyewitnesses, the different eyewitnesses that we meet, the one couple who, they're accused of lying. The treatment that they receive, I think, is interesting. But we get another eyewitness who claims to sort of see the traffic stop. They see the car that was driven by Harris. They see the cop behind the car, but we don't know exactly what they saw. They might not know exactly what they saw. Again, there might have been some other motives. So there's a lot of strands. There's a lot of threads. It's a very complex narrative, and Morris walks us through very capably, very effectively. So it kind of accomplishes the traditional sort of documentary goals, but then it also has this entertainment element that, again, feels a little bit more fictive, feels a little bit more like what we might see in feature-length fiction motion pictures, techniques that might be borrowed from fiction films. And that was noteworthy in the late 80s. I would say now, more typical, a lot of documentaries combine those different elements. All right, so the final thing I want to talk about before we sign off this week is the business side as it pertains to this movie, and Pearson gets into this in the chapter. So this is the first time that I think we've really seen Miramax discussed at length. And that's a company that's going to factor pretty prominently into the story that we tell for the rest of this semester. So I sort of want to dive into it a little bit here. And again, just kind of using Pearson to get us started. So he mentions that the film is eventually purchased by Miramax, which was a distribution company founded by the Weinstein brothers, Harvey and Bob. So we know Harvey Weinstein, unfortunately, and we will have to talk about this guy. He plays a pretty big role in Pearson's book, and he plays a pretty big role on the business side, in some cases even the production side of several of the movies that we're going to be watching this semester. So again, this is the first time Miramax shows up, but it will not be the last. So we're going to have to reckon with this guy, and we know what he did. We know that Harvey Weinstein was accused and convicted of sexual assault, specifically rape. I mean, he was alleged to have committed probably countless numbers of sexual assaults during his time as head of Miramax. I mean, he ran the studio, the company, with his brother. During that time, countless abuses, over 80 women alleged different instances of sexual harassment or sexual abuse. And that really helped kick off the Me Too movement back in 2017 when some of these allegations against Weinstein surfaced. Now, if you guys read anything about that, or if you're movie and sort of entertainment industry nerds like I am, you probably read about Weinstein before that, and you may have heard or read that it's kind of an open secret in Hollywood that Weinstein was a predator, that he would take advantage of young women, usually actresses who were looking to start their careers. And it was kind of well known. I mean, people made what would appear now as pretty tasteless jokes about it. It was joked about on award shows, kind of implied, sort of innuendo, never talked about very openly. But a lot of people later would admit that they knew, that they had heard some of these accounts years earlier, but it was just kind of kept quiet, kind of an industry secret, which is, rather shameful. But as a result of some of those allegations, the whole Me Too movement sort of got underway, and we heard a lot more stories about a lot more powerful men doing the sort of things that Weinstein did. But again, over 80 women alleged these things. He was arrested and charged with rape in 2018 and convicted. And he is currently serving 23 years in prison. According to what I read online, he won't be eligible for parole until 2039, when he's, I think, like in his late 80s. He's, pretty old already. So we know that about Weinstein, and it's certainly going to color our perception of Miramax and the role that they played in this indie film boom that we're really charting right now. So Miramax, and this is why, Pearson's interested in them. Miramax follows this trajectory that we've kind of been talking about a little bit, and Pearson's really interested in this, how all these sort of different distribution studios and kind of indie studios, these companies that were sort of distinct from Hollywood and the mainstream movie industry, started to spring up in the 70s and 80s, primarily to acquire and distribute European art films and homegrown independent films that often needed distributors and needed help with exhibition, those other stages after the production of the film. So, Pearson's talked about this at length. We talked about it a little bit last week. Some of these companies were just offshoots or arms of big studios like United Artists, Paramount. They would sort of see that there was a market for these kinds of films. So they would create a subsidiary or a branch of their bigger entity and say, okay, you guys go out there and find us indies. Buy up these indies. We're going to distribute them and make a pretty good profit. So in some cases, these companies remained under the umbrella of the bigger studios. In other cases, they could kind of spin off and branch off and do their own thing. And still other times, there were just standalone companies that followed a similar business model as far as buying movies, distributing movies. Maybe they were involved in the exhibition sort of aspect of the business, but they were sort of operating autonomously. So Miramax is an example of one that kind of just sprang out of this sort of what would have been considered by entertainment standards as kind of a backwater. Miramax started in Buffalo, New York in the late 70s, again, founded by Harvey and his brother Bob. And they started out mostly distributing like concert films. They were kind of more, they were music promoters originally. So they were kind of on the music side and kind of involved in music films initially. And then they got involved in the home video market. And this is kind of significant for us to just consider. We've talked about the rise of home video, video rental in the 80s. And I think we all probably can remember the days of Blockbuster. Maybe some of you went and rented movies when you were young. It was like the most exciting night of the week in my house. On Fridays, we got to go to Blockbuster, and my sister and I got to pick out movies. My dad would usually pick out something. My mom was indifferent. She just wanted to watch, the blockbusters, whatever. So she would let us pick what we wanted because we had more sort of nerdy tastes, and, that would be a big weekend event. So home video, video rental, and Pearson talks about this at times, it changes the film industry in pretty obvious ways. We don't have to get too concerned with it, but just be aware that that's happening in the 80s, right? The rise of VHS tapes and renting them from video rental stores, that's an 80s thing. So in the mid 80s, the Weinsteins get involved in that, and that's how they really start to make a lot of money and get somewhat prominent. So they're kind of getting the rights, they're acquiring the rights to release certain films on video. And that's a pretty profitable sort of place to be. That's a good market to be in. And then from there, they start buying and distributing independent films. And over the course of the late 80s and the early 90s, they get pretty prominent doing that. And the Thin Blue Line is one of these prominent indies that they get their hands on, and they help make it big. They distribute it theatrically and allow a pretty wide audience to see it. But it's interesting to note that they later get involved on the production side as well. So they start out as a distribution company. So like some of the other distribution companies that Pearson's mentioned, and he even, I think, at times works for distribution companies, they basically buy movies after they've been made. So the money comes from somewhere. Maybe the filmmakers raised it themselves. In the case of the Thin Blue Line, Morris got the money from PBS to do that original documentary on Dr. Death. But then I think he uses that money to actually make this film, and it ends up costing a little over $1 million, I think, according to Pearson. So the movie's done, the production is done, and then Miramax steps in, buys it, and distributes it. So that's what they kind of got going on in the late 80s. And they distribute, and they would, over the course of the late 80s and like the first half of the 90s, they would distribute some really important, influential independent movies, and we're going to watch a couple of these. So Pulp Fiction, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, Clerks, The Crying Game, they distributed all of those. But then they also get into the production side a little bit later on in the 90s. So Shakespeare in Love. That's financed by Miramax. They were financing the production side of that particular film. They also are involved in the production of Flirting with Disaster. That's an early David O. Russell film, if you guys know him. That one stars Ben Stiller, I think. It's not one of Russell's best. Heavenly Creatures was another one that they produced. That was starring Kate Winslet. That film actually came out of New Zealand with a young Kate Winslet, and it was directed by Peter Jackson of Lord of the Rings fame, long before Lord of the Rings, obviously. So these are pretty big movies. They didn't always gross a ton, but they were, at the very least, critically acclaimed, and in many cases, they were very popular as well. So Miramax really made a name for themselves first as a distribution company, and then later they were still distributing movies, but they were also producing them, and a lot of these movies were hits. So Miramax becomes kind of synonymous with independent movies in the 90s. So we're going to return to them, and Pearson will talk about Miramax some more throughout the book, and we'll obviously talk about them at least a little when we're discussing Pulp Fiction, and then later when we do Clerks as well, and then Shakespeare in Love at the very end of the semester. That's our last film, I think. Either that, is it that or Good Will Hunting? They're the last two. They're both like 97, 98. That's as far as we get. But here's what's interesting. Here's the final note for this week about Miramax. In 92, the company strikes a deal with Paramount, one of those old-time major studios that hung around even after the death of the old Hollywood system. So we've heard about Paramount a little bit before, but the big studio here makes an agreement with Miramax to start distributing the movies that Miramax is producing, like their homegrown movies. Paramount makes a deal to say, okay, we'll distribute those. And Paramount, a bigger company, more money, more resources, they have a bigger distribution reach than Miramax would have had on its own. So this is kind of an important move. They're kind of moving up to the true big time at this point, inking a deal with Paramount. And then 1 year later, well, just a final note on that deal. First, it was just from TV and video. But then later they say, okay, we'll also distribute your movies theatrically. So that was a big step. But then it gets eclipsed by an even bigger step the very next year. In 93, Miramax is purchased by the Walt Disney Company. You may have heard of them. They're somewhat well known and prominent in American entertainment today. This was in 1993. And this is really when the Walt Disney Company is first entering like the major motion picture industry. I guess they made movies with like Mickey or whatever back in earlier decades, but this is their entrance into like, big time Hollywood filmmaking. So the Weinsteins continued to run Miramax pretty much as an autonomous entity. They were under that larger Disney umbrella, but unlike other Disney subsidiaries, they were allowed to pretty much do their own thing. The Weinsteins, and again, Bob, I don't think Bob was really implicated in any of Harvey's crimes, but as terrible a person as Harvey obviously is, these guys were good at distributing and producing movies. So they were left alone. Disney saw what they had, and Miramax continued to be this sort of indie film factory. All the way up, really, through the 90s until 2005, when the Weinsteins retired. But I think they still had a fair amount of influence even after that. So again, they play this huge role in this indie film boom that really becomes publicized in the 90s. Like, we're still in the 80s. We're seeing the early stages. Pearson's taking us back to kind of the origins, but by the early 90s, with the emergence of filmmakers like Tarantino, like Spike Lee, like Kevin Smith, again, not all of, but a lot of these films involved with Miramax, released by Miramax, produced by Miramax. So this company plays a big role. But again, we have the larger question of what is independent? Can you still be independent? Can you still be involved in independent movies when you're owned by the Walt Disney Company? But if we think of Miramax as kind of being autonomous, being somewhat separate from Disney, we can see, again, maybe the pipeline of independent films continues, but we'll talk more about this. But certainly, since we are exploring the business side of movie making, it's worth thinking a little bit about Miramax and the Weinsteins. And if we're thinking about Harvey Weinstein and the crimes he committed and the power that he obviously wielded, again, we can explore that. Like, that's a thread that we can pursue in this class if anybody wants to. We don't have to, but it's there. It's something that we can consider because we are going to continue to talk a little bit about the business side. And as we move into the 90s, again, Miramax plays a bigger and bigger role. All right, so that's about all I have for the Thin Blue Line. Just one more interesting note. This was much earlier in my notes, but I skipped over it. I forgot about it. But just if we're thinking about Errol Morris a little bit more generally as a filmmaker, I've already given you his filmography, but he did make one attempt at a feature-length fiction movie. And perhaps not surprisingly, or depending on how much we know about him, he is kind of viewed by many as sort of eccentric, a little bit difficult. I think that kind of comes out when Pearson describes him in the book. So maybe unsurprisingly, his foray into fiction filmmaking was not a success. In 91, he tried to make a film called The Dark Wind, which was an adaptation of a series of books written by this sort of mystery novelist named Tony Hillerman. I don't know if you are familiar with him. He's maybe dead now. He was writing throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. He wrote a series of crime fiction books about a Navajo detective named Jim Chi who solves crimes on the Navajo reservation in Arizona. I read some of those books when I was a kid. My dad was a big Tony Hillerman fan. I didn't know about. I wasn't really aware that Morris had tried to adapt these books before I started researching for this lecture. He does The Dark Wind, but it's never finished. And he apparently had creative differences with one of the producers, the executive producers of the film, Robert Redford, a famous American actor. Probably you guys are probably familiar with him. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting. Like, he was really big in the 70s. I think he retired from screen acting, but he continued to be active up through the 90s, like Indecent Proposal, well up through the 2000s. I think The Old Man and the Gun may have been his last movie. One of my mother's favorite actors, even to this day. But Redford was a producer. He and Morris didn't see eye to eye, so the film never got finished or released. And then 1 year later, they were able to do the film adaptation. They called it, I believe, Skinwalkers, still produced by Redford, came out in 92 with no involvement from Morris. So since then, I think he's largely stuck to documentaries. That's clearly where his strength lies. And again, he's a very influential documentary filmmaker, but he's no stranger to some of those fiction film techniques. So again, think about technical stuff, think about the case itself, think about the nature of knowledge, and maybe do, some comparisons between this film and what we've seen before. So that's it for Morris. I will see you guys next week. And just a quick word on movie screenings. We'll try it again when we can through Amazon Prime, because the Amazon watch parties work well. So whatever movies are on Amazon, we will try to do those screenings just like we did it last week. That was successful. If you guys use my username and password, you won't have to spend any money to get into Amazon. So I'll make that information available for anyone who's interested as we move forward when it's possible. Not all of these films are going to be on Amazon, but in the cases that they are, we can do what we did last week. Okay, I'll see you next week.